right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the virtual forum, Local Laws and Effective Politics, hosted by a Columbus group known as the Communities for Legal Reform Coalition. This is a 90-minute forum based on 3 topics: how the law and interpretation of the law affects cases like George Floyd's and Ahmaud Arbery's, the gaps and loopholes of the law that make systematic racism and discrimination possible, and the process of presenting to our elected officials laws that need to be changed. We will spend about 15 to 20 minutes discussing each topic before receiving final comments from our panel. The goal of this forum is to help citizens understand how to effectively organize and petition their elected officials. If you would like to get involved in taking next steps with this coalition, please use the email address link that's shared in the post, communitiesofreform@gmail.com. My name is Jamie Thomas. I'll be your moderator for this evening. We look forward to sharing this conversation with you. At this time, I'm going to introduce our panel of attorneys. We have 4 prominent attorneys with us this evening: Eutrophia Robinson, Jennifer Dunlap, Chad Mance, and Alex Shelley. So at this time, I'm going to give them a chance, an opportunity to introduce themselves before we get started. So we'll start with Jennifer.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Jennifer Dunlap. I primarily do post-conviction relief. My major goals are to assist those that have been through the conviction process or have been arrested for a criminal offense to get past that and to be able to go to work. So that's what I do.
Thank you, Jennifer. Eutrophia?
Hi, I'm Eutrophia Robinson. My primary areas of practice are personal injury and criminal defense. So I represent individuals who have been injured and those who are facing jail time, whether it be for misdemeanors or felonies. I do trials and assist them with taking pleas if that's the way that the case will come out.
Okay, Alex?
Hey, I'm Alex. I work for Page Screenham. I do mostly commercial and business litigation issues, and I also serve as outside counsel for the Columbus Consolidated Government, and that can at times entail representing law enforcement on a number of issues. That can range anything from habeas corpus to 1983 civil rights issues to personal injury defense issues, because you'd be surprised how often law enforcement get in an accident. So quite frankly, whatever I can get my hands on the civil side as related to business is my area of practice.
Thank you. And Chad?
I'm Chad Mance. I'm a personal injury lawyer. Basically, my practice focuses on representing people who've been injured. We do some constitutional tort or civil rights cases, some cases involving dangerous products, some cases involving injured folks in jail, but we focus on helping injured people.
Thank you. So we're going to jump right in to the first topic. I do want to state that we want this to be a very interactive conversation amongst the panel. So y'all feel free to chime in at any point in time. And I'm just going to kind of guide the conversation and throw some questions out there for you all to discuss. So the first topic is related to George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and really looking at how those gaps and the loopholes will affect the process of those trials. So the first question is, how have the recent deaths of these individuals, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, how have they affected you?
I'll start. So I think that, for those of us who are attorneys here, we also have to acknowledge that at the end of the day, we are also individuals, we're people, we're human beings. And for all of us here on this panel, we happen to look like the people that have been affected in these cases. Every name that you just named could have been our uncles or our sisters, our fathers, our brothers, could have been us. And so I think that for the only word I can think of is trauma, that there is a collective trauma that we've kind of been battling against. It didn't start with Ahmaud Arbery, it didn't start with George Floyd, it did not start with Trayvon Martin. didn't start with Medgar Evers. It's been building. And I think what we're seeing now is that there's a combination of hurt, and it's coming out, and we're all feeling it. And so it's affecting us on a personal level. And as an attorney, especially a criminal defense attorney, I have to sometimes toe that line between being the attorney and walking into a courtroom with people who may not necessarily look like me or share my experience, but the people I'm representing do look like me and do look like Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor, and to keep my emotions intact and not make it emotional and try to stay within the confines of the law. But that's difficult when the law sometimes, the way it's applied to people of color, people that look like Ahmaud and myself, hasn't been fair. And so it's been tough. It gets to be tiring, but we have to press on. We have to press on for justice. We have to keep fighting. We have to swallow it sometimes. And I think that what we're seeing is that a lot of people are getting tired of swallowing things. And so we do have to practice self-care. We do have to acknowledge these things and just look it head on and acknowledge the fact that we're tired, we're exhausted, we're traumatized. And so I have to be that person just as a citizen, as an African American, but I'm also that person as an attorney. And so for me, it's balancing my professional life and my personal life, especially when the lines can often get blurred.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I guess I'll go. Hard to follow up on eutropia. Several things. One is my wife and I have talked about the dynamic. We've talked about raising children and how that might be impacted by the environment that's going on. But we've also talked about the spirit, the zeitgeist of the times that is really promoting freedom and justice and expanding it. You know, I personally think that the deaths of Floyd, Arbery, Breonna, and so many others that preceded them have really served as sort of this key and an ignition to a larger global movement. I think in probably 6 to 12 months, we'll see that start up in the eastern part of the world and places like Egypt and places like, the Middle East, for example. And so I'm encouraged by this movement, although we've had some concerns. And as a family, we've had to kind of sit down and talk about when we raise children, because we don't have any now, how would that impact sort of how we navigate the interaction between government and our family. And so it's really made us kind of do some self-examination, but we're still hopeful about what can happen with this. I do think it's special.
Yeah, just to echo the great points that Chad and Eutropia mentioned. I mean, it's for me personally, it's been devastating, and at the same time, encouraging and seeing a lot of the conversations that it's raised. But I think more than anything, for me, it makes me realize how fortunate I am because I've been on the other side of a service weapon, despite the fact that I was unarmed, despite the fact that I was not confrontational. And to Chad's point, you realize when you see the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Alton Sterling, Trayvon, I mean, so many others. I mean, it could have been me and so many people that I know. A good number of my friends who are Black males have had a service weapon pointed at them at some point. And so these are real conversations that we have to have amongst each other, that we have to have with our children. I have 2 daughters, and it's something that's been going on for a long time. And the best we can hope for is that the recent events will actually incite real change.
Jennifer, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just to add on to that, I definitely agree with what everyone said, and I really think that now is the time for change. I don't think I've ever seen or known of another time where people were paying attention, and it's not just that people know about it; it's more that they're actually engaged. And it may be because they're, you know, we're all kind of on our phones and all that kind of thing. And so this sort of culture we have of videotaping everything and putting everything online, it has its negatives, but at the same time, it's something that has now been used to expose the things that if, you know, Eutropia, you've done criminal defense, you know, the clients say these things all the time to you. Well, when they stopped me, they did this to me and they did that. And what are you saying is criminal defense? You're going, well, but you had this in your pocket. I mean, and so you got to kind of move through the case almost ignoring that information because you can't substantiate it really outside of what the person is saying to you. And it becomes like something kind of in the way of negotiations where a person might really end up in prison because they want to talk about what happened to them on the side of the road, as opposed to, hey, here's the crime and here's what they're saying you did. So it's kind of like, you know, there's always a pendulum in everything. And sometimes, you know, it swings to the left and then it swings to the right. And right now, what I love that's happening in this country is now we're swinging back to where people are again listening to the criminal defendant, to the person who is sometimes wrongfully charged, and saying, okay, let me actually listen to you. Let me look into that the history of that officer, because I'm no longer going to just assume that because this person is in law enforcement that they are 100% telling the truth about every aspect of this arrest. And that's something that's critical, really. It's something that always kind of should have been there in our criminal process. But I think it's just, it's amazing. And what I want to see more is us using that to actually put forth an agenda, a doable, workable agenda, and then push that through to our lawmakers, our local lawmakers, the folks who are making our city ordinances. All of those things affect us on a daily basis. And I think now is the time, if we can just kind of get together on what our major points are, I think the system is ready to hear us. And that's what's really been beautiful with everything as a hopeful outcome.
Absolutely. If I can add to what Jennifer just said, actually, let me turn this one off over here. So I had an event, I had a phone conference yesterday with a prosecutor in Fulton County. I represent an individual who's been accused of some serious felonies that carry some serious time, and he has a criminal past. He was arrested started his first prison sentence 2 weeks after his 19th birthday. He served 10 years in prison. And so now, we've received discovery, the state is ready for trial. My client is also ready for trial. I don't think it's a good idea to try the case because the state could prove their case. But now, so in the negotiation process of sentencing, the question is, do you send this man who went into prison as a 19-year-old, came out at 29 to a world he didn't understand, a world he wasn't equipped to live in, to re-enter society and not be able to take care of himself? Of course, that makes you wonder what would cause a man who's just spent 10 years in prison to walk into a convenience store with a gun and ask for money. Could it be that he has no other way to take care of himself? And so what this atmosphere has created is a platform for me to actually have that conversation with the prosecutor when she's making her sentencing recommendations. Are we really going to rehab somebody by just throwing them in a cage for the next 25 years when the system failed them to begin with? So I think I'm in a unique situation where I do represent injured individuals as well as criminal defendants. And when I make a demand in a personal injury case, say for a car accident, I've got to paint a clear picture of who my client is when I send that demand. I want you to know exactly who you hit. It wasn't just a car in front of you. It was a person. It was a mother. And I'll tell you about that person. I tell the insurance company about that person so they can understand why I'm fighting for that person. Well, I take that same approach with these defendants. You need to know that this is just not the state of Georgia versus defendant who did whatever you say he's accused of. This is a person who's grown up in a system that has been set up against him for, since he was a child, and then you put him into a prison system that also doesn't care about him, and you want him to re-enter into society. I don't think that the prosecutors were in as much of a position before as they are now to actually hear that, to know that that affects people on a daily basis, that affects the decisions that they make, the options that they have. And so when you have some prosecutors, and luckily in Fulton County, there are more open-minded prosecutors who are willing to listen. And she has taken the first offer, which was 25 years to serve, off the table. And we're now in a position where we can renegotiate. And she sees him as a person rather than just another defendant that committed an offense. But unfortunately, in some rural counties, I'm getting the complete opposite, where race relations aren't as smooth as they may be up in Atlanta. Down in South Georgia, you may have some prosecutors who happen to be offended by the outcries that people of color are making right now. It's either offending them or they aren't sympathetic to the cause, whatever the reason. That also comes through when they make their sentence recommendations. When you have someone who should be accused of, a small crime where the scale is small, can be 1 to 10 years, and the automatic recommendation is the max, 10 years. Today in 2020, I am still facing prosecutors who don't want to hear that my client is a person, who don't want to hear that she's a mother that has children, and if you send her away from her kids, who's going to provide? That's not their problem. So there's still work to be done. But I think that, given both sides of the coin, that we are making progress. So we keep making noise. People are listening, and people who are in positions to do something are able to do things. And we probably will see more change now than we have seen in the past.
Thank you for sharing that. Jennifer, you touched on something that I want to go back to. You had mentioned that one thing that's different now is that we're all on our phones. People are recording things. People can go live. So what's really the difference between what we see in the media, whether it's news media, social media, and then the information that is presented in the courts?
Well, I think, because when you talk about what's presented in the court, you have two different sides. And just like Eutropia was saying, when you're on the defense, you tend to see things through that point of view. And when you're in prosecution, you're seeing the case in almost black and white on paper. And so, and I've been in prosecution for a while, I've been in defense for a while, and there's a whole different sort of feeling to a case. And so what I mean by, media exposure is just, I think that sometimes there are prosecutors, especially younger ones, who will come out of school and believe that somebody wearing blue is always telling the truth. And there's not another layer to that conversation. Whatever is written in that report is what happened. And now when, a defendant may be saying something that's not necessarily against what's in the report, but maybe adding to what's in the report, there's more of a concept of, okay, well, let me figure out how that really could have gone. And, it's something that you can kind of pull out of that officer. What I would like to see is access to training history. I would love to be able to have that. And I think really almost as a public matter of not necessarily public safety, but just of fairness almost. What is their history on the street when it comes to like complaints being filed against them? And those are things that kind of hold everyone accountable. And when we say hold police accountable, a lot of times like that's now being phrased in, okay, arrest an officer when he does something negative, but really we need like more of a day-to-day accountability. And if they know, hey, if, I continue to act in this manner, maybe that's a little bit too rough with citizens. And if citizens continue to make complaints against me, then those are continue to be documented and continue to erode my personal veracity when I get in a courtroom. And then we'll continue to, have an effect on the cases that I make. Then that may be a good thing. I don't know what everybody else thinks about that, but.
Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I think Jennifer raises a good point. I mean, thank God for the camera phones, because I think for a long time a lot of people thought the stories we told about police interactions were urban legend, and now that it's on now that it's on visual display, I think that's certainly helped significantly in raising the overall public awareness about police issues that affect African Americans like us uniquely. Now, to your question about the discrepancies between what might be projected in the news media and what might be projected in the courtroom, I do think that we also have to be careful of recognizing that with all these events, we cannot put all police in a box. With the news media, they're going to magnify the events that have gone wrong involving police officers at this current time, and rightfully so. I mean, those deserve attention because there needs to be a heightened sense of awareness, and there needs to be change that becomes a byproduct of that. And as someone who represents law enforcement, I also have a unique vantage point of knowing that the law enforcement gets sued on a regular basis, and they're in a position where they have to make quick judgments. And I've never, in the hundreds of cases I've handled representing law enforcement, I never at one time felt like I had to sacrifice my moral compass or make a moral dilemma. The fact is that I think every law enforcement personnel that I've represented and acted with, I got the sense that they were doing their job in good faith. Now, admittedly, I haven't handled some of the more complicated cases, and I would be lying if I said to you that there weren't cases in which here locally in which law enforcement should not have been held account for their actions, but I do think that with the focus being primarily on the issues regarding wrongful actions by law enforcement, I do think we also need to be careful to not put them in a box, just like we don't want law enforcement or other people to put us in a box. I think we need to make sure that we do the same.
So how does the public get good information? It's not uncommon that we can hear the same story by different media outlets, and it will be a totally different story. So how do we get, I guess, the best and most impartial information?
I don't necessarily know that there are any completely impartial sources of information, but I think doing your due diligence is to check multiple sources. If you think that, and I happen to believe that this is true, certain news media outlets put a certain spin on news stories, check the other side. Check a couple of sources, and then what's a common thread among them. And oftentimes the local newspapers probably have it better than national newspapers may have it. So I would check what local newspapers and see what the local official reports are, as opposed to just the talking heads that we see on CNN, Headline News, Fox News, because those things are for ratings, but we're living real life here. And so I think local news reporters aren't necessarily doing what they're doing for ratings, but to get the people the information. Check multiple sources.
Any other comments on that?
If you're talking about a lawsuit that's been filed, that's a public record. You can just access that through the court system, and there are filings on both sides. So, that's sort of a balanced way to figure out what's going on in the litigation. If it involves, for example, a police misconduct case or a high profile case. If you're talking about just, sort of general news stories is going to be pretty difficult. Like Eutropia said, you just got to go out and read different vantage points from juxtaposing positions, and then try to reconcile them yourself, I think.
So as we look at these cases that we've been discussing, what typically determines the outcomes? And in your opinion, are the laws fair, particularly to people of color?
So if you're talking about like a high profile police misconduct case, excuse me, hell no. In fact, in the 11th Circuit where we are, you got federal judges that have said, we don't like these cases. Now, the rationale behind it is that you'll bankrupt the government if you sue them all the time. And I get that. But you've got only the big damages cases where people have broken bones or concussions, or like they're dead, or they're shot on video, pummeled. And those are the only real cases that most plaintiffs' lawyers or lawyers bringing the action will take if they're prudent. Most of the times we do have to hire police experts, so the economic barriers to justice are very, very significant. If you're talking about a case against a jail or a prison entity, it's even more high stakes. For example, my firm represented a guy that's a paraplegic, and because of the nature of the claim, the most we could settle that case for was $250,000. He'll never walk again, for example, but because of the nature of the claim and the high probability that it would have been tossed out, it was a relatively decent result, and that's pretty sad. So the barriers are very high. The laws themselves, the civil rights laws, the 1983 statute itself, originated from Reconstruction. That was at a time when Blacks were trying to protect their rights through the federal government. The federal government acknowledged it. In fact, it was a criminal offense in the Civil Rights Act of 1871 at first. Then that got repealed. Then at some point, we find our way to the current Civil Rights Statute, 1983, which is really, if you read the statute, it's designed to be broad, but it's interpreted very narrowly and specifically so that it forecloses the opportunity to bring certain actions. The reason why is you have to show a pattern, a practice, a policy, a custom by the government to be able to sue the government, because generally there's a presumption that you can't sue the government. So my point is there's economic barriers, there are barriers that I think are quasi-political, at least in our judicial system, and there are other societal barriers to bringing these actions. What's going on now is awakening the public consciousness so that we can have a chance at redirecting this thing. But, I'm worried because our president, Tan Man, he is appointing federal court judges at a very, very alarming rate, and they're disproportionately white, and they're disproportionately male, and disproportionately conservative, and they're the ones that are going to hear the most of these cases. So it's going to take a lot for us to reverse this. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Anyone else have anything to share on that question? So, Alex, were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to Chad's point. It is hard to, at least on the civil side, to obtain a favorable judgment against a local government or a public official. In order to obtain judgment against the local government, you have to get past official immunity, in which you have to show that the local government promulgated a policy that led to the constitutional right violation, and that's really hard to show. I mean, you got to show something in the policy that or the standards that they provide their employees cause the violation, or often you have to show a failure to train, some kind of deficiency in the training process, or a repeated pattern of conduct within that local government to suggest that the local government basically advocated for that policy. And that's key, because when you are trying to seek monetary relief for a constitutional right violation, you're only, well, oftentimes your best chance of getting real money is to go after the local government, because the public official that's involved, I mean, especially if it's a police officer, they're not going to have anything to recover from. Now, I mean, we're talking about, folks who generally get paid between $30,000 and $50,000 a year. So the relief prospects aren't going to be there. Now, when you are trying to recover against someone individually, however, the immunity standard is lower. But even that it's still a difficult barrier. It's called qualified immunity, which you've probably heard a good bit of these days, in which in order to recover from someone individually, you have to show that there was a clearly established constitutional right that was violated. So in other words, a plaintiff has to show that there is some type of case precedent in their local federal court of appeals circuit, or that's been handed down from the Supreme Court, that makes clear that your set of factual circumstances constitutes a constitutional right. And that can be really difficult to show. It's a very fact-intensive analysis, but the overall idea behind it is such that law enforcement need to be able to make quick decisions and do their job, and not be punished for making reasonable mistakes. Now, thankfully, to Chad's point, qualified immunity does not protect those who are just plainly incompetent or who are malicious in carrying out their job. So, for example, at least in theory, it shouldn't protect someone like Derek Chauvin, who clearly maliciously murdered George Floyd. And there are a number of less extreme circumstances, at least in theory, qualified immunity shouldn't protect. But what you do find, though, even if you're not able to, and it doesn't apply all across the board, but in circumstances in which you're not able to recover from the local government, but you might be able to recover from the individual, and you get past that qualified immunity barrier, there are certain situations, not all the time, but in which the city will cover for their law enforcement personnel whatever judgment they obtain. So I mean, there's still a possibility of recourse, but there certainly are difficult barriers to that.
Thank you. So at this time, let's shift into topic 2. We know that systematic racism and discrimination are alive and happening in 2020. So in what ways do they play into the justice system today? Oh, you're on mute.
I kind of hit on it a little bit earlier, but with sentencing. So when you have prosecutors that don't necessarily look like the people that they're prosecuting, like some police officers are policing neighborhoods that they don't live in, it's often difficult to convey the importance of getting the sentencing right, because we do want justice. We do believe in justice, and it's not that we are justifying that all criminal acts should go without any type of punishment or recompense. But again, how harsh of a sentence should it be? And that's what we see. If the people who sit on the bench, or the people who sit in the power to represent the state as the prosecutors, if they don't have the empathy that's necessary, then we're going to continue to see the system and systematic racism railroad people of color and people who are accused of crimes. And we all know that not everybody who's been accused of a crime is guilty of that crime. Or even if they've committed a crime, sometimes laws are set up as a trap anyway. I don't know if anybody's read Slavery by Another Name, but a lot of the laws that are on the books were designed to entrap people of color, like loitering, for example. This law was passed after it became illegal to own slaves, but it was illegal to have indentured servants for the purposes of corrections. Well, if you're standing around and you have nothing to do, like most freed slaves didn't have anything to do, that became a law. And so now you've just broken a law. What should the sentence be? And so we know in many jurisdictions around the United States, the possession of marijuana is not only legal, but it's an emerging market. But in some jurisdictions, that's still illegal. And we have harsh sentencing being enforced for nonviolent offenses like possession of drugs, recreational drugs that may be legal in one market that make a certain group of people wealthy, but are taking away the freedom of other individuals. And that's just a perpetuation of systemic racism. We know back in the 80s when there were the crack epidemic, crack and cocaine are the same drugs in different forms, but the sentencing laws were different. If you got caught with crack, you're going to get a harder sentence than you would if you got cocaine, which happens to cost more than crack. So that's playing itself out in a different way now, but it's more of the same. So that's those are the things that if we're going to talk about justice reform that we should focus on, how we are applying sentencing laws across the board.
And that really leads into the next question, really talking about what are some of those laws and issues that really need to be addressed so that we can mitigate systematic racism and discrimination.
Well, I wanted to just kind of go back to the previous topic just a little bit, because I think something that really kind of gets in the way is kind of like a lack of separation between the police and the prosecution. So sometimes, it could be, on the street, and from doing district attorney work, it looked a lot of the times like people who would aggravate the police would honestly get like higher charges. And so whereas, for instance, somebody with a gun and waving it at a crowd, okay, they could be charged with pointing a pistol at another misdemeanor. They could be charged with disorderly conduct, or they might be charged with aggravated assault, which is a 1 to 20 year offense and will send you to superior court, where the other 2 offenses will send you to state court, and you may even get a ticket, for the disorderly conduct. And so decisions like that, when we talk about systematic racism, sometimes, and I don't know the statistics on it, but those officers do have the choice of which one of those offenses they want to charge for the same conduct. So that's fine. Officers make those decisions on the street for whatever reason. However, when that case gets to a prosecutor, it's up to the prosecutor to formally charge for that conduct. Now, the DA who gets that offense can say, I'm downgrading this to pointing a gun at another, or the solicitor who gets that offense can say, I'm upgrading that to aggravated assault. And so a lot of times what I saw from within the system was whatever charge came over, the prosecution sometimes looks at that as they're actually defending the police by carrying on the charge almost, rather than taking a fresh eye at what they're looking at on paper and saying, what should this really be? And I think that things like that help to dismantle systematic racism. So if there is a racial issue coming in from the ground level, and this maybe has been overcharged because the officer took a particular disliking to this person for a right reason or wrong reason, then the prosecutors really are there, and they're supposed to be the kind of guardians of justice to say, no, this should be this, or this should be that offense. And I think that's a critical thing that is happening now, where there's, prosecutors are people too, and they don't necessarily want to have, the police upset at them and telling their boss, that they're messing with their charges, and they can get very territorial about that, which leads to less separation between powers. And I think we really do need that. We need independent prosecutors who are going to look at an offense and call it how they think it should be. They're not on the street, which takes away from their ability to assess 100% the situation, but they can talk to that officer. But they should talk to the officer as a witness in the case, not necessarily as the authority in what should be charged, because that is the job of the prosecutor.
Yeah, I think to answer your question about an area of the law where there should be changes that could mitigate the racial impacts that some of the laws have on us. I think Trophy kind of spoke to that point. A lot of times you do see it in drug charges and nonviolent crimes. We know that despite the fact that blacks and whites use drugs at a comparable rate, including marijuana, we know that blacks are 4 times more likely to get arrested and prosecuted for marijuana possession. And we've seen the trend of some states and jurisdictions legalizing marijuana. I know in certain counties here in Georgia, I think Fulton may be one of them. Correct me if I'm wrong, Trophy. That they no longer, for the most part, enforce drug possession charges, and we just elected a DA here who committed to not prosecuting marijuana possession related crimes. Now, I don't know to what degree he can actually can dictate that, and we'll see if they're able to follow through on that. But that's certainly one of the key areas that I find, because if you're a young kid and you get dinged up on a weed possession charge, that could really change the trajectory of your life. And so that's one area that comes to mind for me pretty quickly.
Yes, Alex, to your point, I think that is, so it's not legal. It is not enforced. It's so much though, so much that the prosecutors are using what should be used anyway, which is prosecutorial discretion. Like Jennifer was saying, whether or not those charges are going to be upgraded or downgraded, or if it's going to be prosecuted at all. So I know a big part of this forum is talking about the local laws, but I think that's something that we should pay attention to every election cycle. Who's up for prosecutor in your local jurisdiction? And what are their stances and their viewpoints on things that have historically and disproportionately affected people of color? Does that prosecutor have an open mind? Does that prosecutor, is there a pulse to the street? Are they feeling the culture and the crowds and what's happening? Or are they, sort of arcane and stuck in the past, or have closed-minded or racist views, to be quite blunt? That's why it's important to vote in local elections when there's somebody on the ballot to be the district attorney, to be the solicitor. Those are the things we need to pay attention to, because those are the people that our loved ones and our clients come in contact with after they've been arrested, to determine what the sentence is going to be or what the outcome is going to be, like Alex said, that can affect the rest of their lives.
And I'm sorry to steal your role for a little bit, Jamie, but I had a question for that I think Trophy or Jennifer could help answer, because I know the DA that was just elected here committed to stopping weed prosecutions, and my question for the folks who had criminal legal backgrounds is to what degree does the DA or can the DA dictate that? Because I thought the solicitor's office, I just assumed that marijuana possession was often classified as a misdemeanor, which would therefore be handled by the solicitor's office.
You're exactly right.
But also depends on how much you have, how much you're in possession of.
On how much you have, but so what he's saying is he wants to decriminalize, marijuana possession, but he's in Superior Court, and we do have a state court here that generally, what the difference is going to be, what other charges are there. So if a person is stopped, for, there's an odor of marijuana and they're stopped and then they later find cocaine. Okay, that's going to Superior Court, and he can choose to say they're not going to prosecute the misdemeanor marijuana. The individual will be prosecuted on the other felony, on the felony offense. It's only going to go to his office if it has an associated felony with it. So the ultimate effect of that, I don't know what effect he thinks he can have on that. But when it comes to, what the solicitor's office is going to do, she has not said that. So people thinking that he's got all authority over marijuana is going to be a rude awakening when they realize their case is not, and I think some people get the idea that because he, is going to be the DA, that somehow he's the head prosecutor and that person is over the solicitor because they're higher, sort of dealing with higher offenses. But that's not the case. The solicitor is an elected official as well. And I don't think that's going to come out of our solicitor's office. So people really need to pay attention to that difference. I'm glad you brought that up, Alex, because I don't think people are getting that point.
Yeah, and that's what I suspected, but I wasn't sure. And I mean, shit, I guess the hope is that maybe other elected officials, prosecutors, future solicitors, future DAs will at least pay attention to the political message, and the fact that that's something that the public supports. But thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, so we're going to move into our third topic, and that is really how do we as citizens get involved in the process? So the first question is really, how can the general public become involved in the process of identifying the laws and practices that leave that door open for discrimination?
I think it starts at home. You got to have these discussions with your children, your parents, your immediate circle of influence. And then once you guys have identified in your immediate circle of influence what's important to you, then you got to figure out what official or entity has the most influence politically or otherwise on the situation. And then you've got to figure out what your negotiating points are, who or what would influence that person to make a decision in a favorable way for you. We know that votes influence politicians, donations influence politicians, right? There may be certain organizations, for example, in Savannah, the NAACP, it largely carries the voice of the African-American community with respect to political votes. So if you know of an organization like that, that has political sway, sit down with the folks in the organization and take involvement and really propose an agenda. Go on the offensive. So that's politically. When we're talking about economically, if you were to look at who donates to whose campaigns, that will tell you a lot about that person's affiliations and allegiances politically. And so if the donors, for example, are not pro what you're for, and they have economic influence in the community, I think you can wage an economic protest against them if it's that egregious, for example. So there are a number of ways. Sitting down with your local lawmaker is very important. Lawmakers need feedback from community influencers, and you don't have to be a lawyer to do that. So there are a number of ways to get involved. The big thing is to just start somewhere and build upon that.
Anyone else?
I think it absolutely starts at home, Chad. But then it becomes important that there are a collection of homes, community. The sense of community is actually really important. It took me a while to learn who my neighbors were, but they live right next door and I see them every day. I don't know if that's everyone's situation, but it's not like it was when we were younger, where the neighbors could probably watch your kids in the afternoon until you come back. It's not necessarily like that anymore for various reasons. Everybody doesn't trust everyone with their children. I get that. But having a general sense of community and knowing what affects your local community, I think that's important. Like if we're going to change the culture, it starts person to person. These are people to people experiences. And if we can change the barriers, if we're going to attach the barriers between us, and it starts with, hey, neighbor, I've been living here for a while. here's my name, here's my number. If you need anything, you can contact me. I think that we're global citizens because we have cell phones and we think that we know everybody because they're in our timelines, in our feed. But yet we don't take the time to get to know the person that lives right next door to us. They may have a flag flying, whether it's a sports team or other flags, that may make it a little bit uncomfortable to say hello. But I think we have to start taking that initiative to say hello, to get to know people. And because on the local level, it's going to be your county commissioners, who's running for county commissioners and the things that affect you on a county level, who's running for the local sheriff, who's running for sheriff's office. But if you don't really know the voice of the community, because you don't really know your community, it may be a little bit overwhelming when it becomes election time. You're just looking at the signs and all the names in front of you, but I don't know who they are. Do they live in my neighborhood? Do they know what my neighborhood's like? So we've got to develop the neighborhood again, the community again.
That's a very good point. Really, that was, part of the next question is, who are those key players when it pertains to local laws, and how are those local laws written, interpreted, and executed? Who do we need to be, looking for when it's time to vote in those local elections? What are the races that will really have an impact on local law? You had said county commissioners, and what are some of those other races locally that really start to impact our communities?
The DA's race is huge, and I feel like Eutropia and Jennifer can really comment on that more. Certainly Superior Court judge races are important because they'll hear a lot of the felony cases, for example, and other cases. But I'm going to tell you one that probably doesn't seem local, but it has local impact. That's the election of the president. What we are seeing at a faster rate than we've seen in a very long time is the appointment of federal trial judges who will decide civil rights cases in a civil rights era. And they will decide them in a very exacting way, for example. So many of these judges were queried about how they felt about repealing the Brown decision or something like that. And a lot of them would not even answer the question. So that's very disconcerting. And these are judges that have been appointed for life. So if you really want to make a difference on the civil rights plane, please, please, please get out and vote for a president that will put federal judges in place that are sympathetic to the plight of folks that have been harmed by constitutional violations. So those are a few things that I think will make a difference on a local level.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Chad. And to further build on Trophy's point, I mean, you can't discount the impact that our local elections have. And we've talked about the judges, the DAs, and the solicitors, but also your state representatives and your state senators, because the laws that are in the Georgia Code, they come out of the General Assembly. And so, you want to make sure that that you certainly pay attention to the folks up there and make sure you're voting for someone who you believe in, that'll advocate for legislation that you believe in.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one thing I always encourage people to do is to actually, it's like we have access to all the knowledge in the world because we have the internet. We can the whole code section is on the internet. And all of our city ordinances, which our city ordinances are come from our mayor and our city council. And that's one thing that differs from one city to another. Okay. In Georgia, we have so many counties, it's no telling how many cities we have. But all of those laws apply to you when you walk out your front door. And people are always caught off guard when they find out, oh, I can't do this, I can't do that. There's a law about this, there's a law about that. There's so many laws. People get together all year long to figure out more laws to apply to you. And so I think a lot comes on, educating yourself about what laws are out there. And any one of them that you think you don't like, you should look further into. Also, people kind of have to seek knowledge with the people in their community that they think work in the systems that they think are offending them. So, you know, people, like, for instance, to go back to what Alex was talking about with the election of our DA, okay, with the election video that came out, a lot of people were upset. How did these two young men get arrested? Well, there was some misplaced anger because people don't really understand who causes and where does the investigation come from? Where did it start? Where does it end? Who does something next? And it's almost like civics, where people have to understand the system. How is it built? What funnels to what? So that they don't go get upset at A and it's really B that's the cause. And you sometimes can't figure that stuff out from your own point of view as just a citizen. You really have to ask someone in the system. And, you know, most people answer questions like that that are just general about how does this work? When you arrest someone, where does the case go if you're sheriff? Where does the case go if you're police? Things like that. So that then they can hold the proper party responsible for whatever it is that they do or don't like.
So as a community, how do we come together to actually petition these elected officials to get laws changed and to make an impact? What is the process and what does that have to look like? What information do we need to include to make sure that we have a solid, you know, request when we go and speak to these lawmakers?
I don't think it really includes a whole lot. I think it starts with just asking your lawmaker to sit down and talk to them. You'd be surprised who will sit down and talk to you and listen to you. Everything from your local congressperson to your local general assemblyman or House of Representative, a political figure to your local senator. They are more easy to access than you think. Two, if you want to form a group, an interest group, an organization, even if it's a neighborhood organization around a certain specific mission, that's always helpful to bring political figures out. They want numbers a lot of times because the more people in the room, the more opportunity to air a platform. You can also give to a campaign if you have those disposable resources. Giving to a campaign is a form of free political speech. There are many things that you can do. I think you should just get out, figure out what your personality has a preference for, and start where you are.
Yeah, I think I agree, and I think there are a number of different ways you could try to petition the people that make these decisions. I mean, we're seeing it now. I mean, the protests have had more of an impact on potentially altering legislation than I could have ever imagined. And you know, anytime you mobilize on in mass and you're able to leverage your political capital, and we have a lot more political capital than we often realize, that's incredibly helpful. I think during one of the discussion during the discussion we had a couple of weeks ago, I think Jennifer was the one who raised the point about generating empirical data to support legislation initiatives that we think would be better for our community. So if, for example, if we're trying to have an impact on changing drug legislation so that it's fair and more equitably applied to our community, then you know, we need to figure out a way to work with the prosecutors and the defense attorneys to figure out what the stats look like. If we can present empirical data that shows that, hey, in our community, this particular type of law is adversely and unfairly impacting us, you know, I think that helps when you can take that to your local representative or present that to the General Assembly. I think there are just a number of different ways we can petition for real legislative change in our favor.
So one final question that we'd like to hear from each member of the panel, and really just in your own opinion, what changes would you like to see in the justice system? And we'll start with Jennifer. Hold on, you're muted.
Right, I'm muted. So what I would like to see is changes in our sentencing in the state of Georgia. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Oh, nope, can't. So Georgia is and has been for as far back as the research goes, way out ahead of everybody for the amount of adults on supervision. So I think like 1 in 13 people in Georgia are on some type of supervision. That means probation. Georgia is,
if you want to try to share your screen, you should be able to.
All right. All right, I am almost there. This one. Okay, so this is what the numbers look like. That's ridiculous. So you can see what we've got is the probation rate that's way out here with Georgia, and then every other state way down from where we are. This is disturbing for a lot of reasons, and we've had criminal justice initiatives to try to fix this. And what they've done is, they found out that Georgia is giving out sentences longer than everyone else's sentences. In Georgia, you commit a theft by shoplifting, you're getting 10 years of probation for that offense. Whereas in other states, they're getting 2 years of probation for that offense. That person, no matter what happens and how terribly they act on probation, they are going to be done with it in 2 years. You can't revoke them after that. But in Georgia, a person may complete their, to kind of finish. I'm trying to figure out how to switch this back. There we go. Stop share. So a person may, violate their probation at year 3. They may be on unsupervised probation, but they get arrested for a traffic offense, for driving while license suspended. They go back to jail. Their probation gets revoked. So what it does is it feeds the prison industry, because most people who are going to prison are violating probation. So it seems like, oh, okay, well, let's just put a whole bunch of people on probation rather than incarcerating. And that sounds like a wonderful idea. But at the end of the day, it becomes a short chain, and it gets yanked every time someone does something. And we're having 10, 15, 20 years where the state can just yank your whole life away and put you right back in custody. And that's not to say that people who, can't fly straight shouldn't pay for it. It's just, how long does something from the distant past still keep coming up for that person? And the rest of the country, just looking at those stats alone would sort of show that this is not normal what's happening in Georgia. What I would like to see locally in Muskogee County, I would like to see shorter sentences. I would like to see that all over the state of Georgia, shorter sentences for every offense. I mean, it's just, we need to get on board with what everyone else is doing. And so our criminal justice initiatives have made it so that, now when you get a long sentence of 15 years probation, now they're saying, okay, well, that really means 2 years supervised, and then you go to unsupervised if you don't violate. Then you do 1 year unsupervised, and then at that point, Probation Management Act says now they can go ahead and motion the court, the probation officer, to have your sentence terminated. Therefore, most people on these long sentences of probation are really only supposed to be doing 3 years. Now, why would our lawmakers want to put that into place, saying basically no matter what sentence you get for probation, you really don't need to do any more than 3 years? And then we still have prosecutors handing out these long sentences. There's a disconnect there. And what I would like to see is for a reduction in general sentencing that we're doing on a daily basis in our courtrooms around the state of Georgia, so that what's happening in our prosecution is similar to what the state is saying now is reasonable and more in line with what's going on in the country.
Thank you. Eutropia?
I mean, kind of hard to follow up with that one because I like that too. I have clients right now who, for the very example that you gave, your license was suspended and you didn't know it, but it happened as a matter of law and you're on probation. So now you're up for a probation violation. I think that's ridiculous as well. But what I'd like to see is a more consistent application of laws just across the board. Our Constitution as it was written, if you take the whole 3/4 of a person out, or excuse me, 3/5 of the person out, and that the founding fathers didn't consider us people in the first place, the way the Constitution was written is supposed to safeguard citizens of this country from its government overstepping their boundaries and taking their rights away. If it were actually applied across the board, the way that it should be, you should be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. You should be free to bear arms. Like Philando Castile legally had the right to carry a firearm, but he was judged and executed on the spot for exercising that right. If the laws were applied consistently, the officer that shot him should have been held accountable. There should not be any wiggle room if the laws are applied consistently across the board. And what's good for the goose has to be good for the gander. If we are citizens and things are illegal for us to do, then those other citizens who have taken oaths to protect and serve us also need to be held accountable in the same way. But another way that it needs to be consistent is with sentencing, and that needs to be transparent. If they're handing out probation in Fulton County, but in Muskogee and Meriwether County, you're going to jail for 10 years, we need to know that that's within the same state. That's not just New York and Georgia. That's from Georgia down, from the middle of Georgia down to Macon or down to Valdosta. We're getting different sentencing, and that just doesn't seem right, especially even just within a state. So I would like to see more transparency there and just accountability for how these things are being applied. If we're going to do justice, then what's good for the goose has just got to be good for the gander.
Great point. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already talked about this at length, but just the interpretation and enforcement of drug possession laws, which adversely impact our community. And I mean, I think Jennifer raises a really interesting point about a lot of the post-conviction barriers that folks in our community face, because not only do they have a tremendous economic impact in terms of your ability to get gainful employment, but it also, I mean, at least here in our community, I mean, it really undermines our political capital as well, in terms of not being able to vote, in terms of not being able to bear arms or just exercise some of the other basic rights that folks all over the country enjoy.
Thank you. Chad, do you have anything to add?
I think everybody did a great job sort of summing everything up. I have one narrow point. I'd like for us to have greater influence over the system and exert that, whether that's funding campaigns that are worthy, actually being involved in the system as judges or district attorneys or influencers, or even, creating alternatives, policy proposals to undesirable status quos.
So before we close, there is a question in the chat asking what are some good websites or resources that we can use to stay abreast on the direction of our cities and states, whether it be city council meetings or special groups. What are some of those resources and how do we access them?
Yeah, so here locally, the city council has a web page. I believe it's on columbus.gov. I could be wrong, but they are it's pretty up to speed in posting the resolutions that are passed here locally. And I believe the General Assembly has something similar. The information can be obtained by a basic search, but those would be at least at the local level and state level resources in which you can monitor what's coming out of the your local city council or the General Assembly in Atlanta.
So there was a lot of great information shared tonight. I want to thank each of you for participating in this panel and speaking to the issues and sharing your expertise on these issues. Does anyone have any final closing comments that they'd like to share with the audience? Words of encouragement, anything to just close us out.
The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. As Dr. King said, it takes time. We're in a democracy. Democracies are composed of fallible human beings. But as long as we have the courage to speak out and exercise our First Amendment rights and our other constitutional rights, we can make it better. And what's going on with Floyd, what's going on with Arbery, what's going on with the many, many, many folks that have died before them is that it is manifested in the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times that's saying society's ready to open the public consciousness up to some revolutionary change. And if that's not encouraging, I don't know what is. So I think that now is our time. Now is our moment. Now would sort of be like akin to what our parents had in the 70s and the late 60s. For us, we can make something special happen, but the system will not change without appropriate pressure. And do not think that you're powerless, because you've got all the power in the world.
Thank you.
Amen.
Oh, yeah.
All right, well, to all of our viewers, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really hope that this forum has been beneficial to you and that it's provided you with some useful information, and really that it's helped to kind of stir something up on the inside that inspires you to take action and to get involved. If you would like to get involved with this coalition, please use the email address that is in the Facebook live feed, and that is communitiesofreform@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching, and thank you to our panel. Good night.
Thank you.